You're listening to Liminal Frames with Nathan and Darren. It's good to be back with all of you listeners as we explore the many and varied experiences that we have in our strange reality. Today's show is going to be really interesting as Darren and I kind of jump into some recent event material I think all of you are probably paying attention to if you're paying attention to anything in the UFO space in the last several weeks. I'm excited about that. But before we dive into that content, Darren, it is the holiday season. I want to check in with you and see how your holiday has been. We're only a couple of days post Christmas for those who celebrate that holiday. And want to see, how was your holiday time?
My holiday was very interesting, I must say. I saw some family before Christmas, but actually on Christmas Day, it was just me and Willow here in the cabin. And I had a really interesting experience where I basically conducted this protocol to put myself into this non-ordinary state experience, to say the least. And it was related to something that had happened about a week previous, which I commented about on social media, where I said, quote, "In a sauna tent up in my loft yesterday, I experienced something profound and surprising while in a deeply meditative state. Been processing it ever since. Less like a standard OBE, more like a bifurcation of consciousness involving biological AI and a dislodged essential self." Unquote. So that was the experience I had a while ago. And in retrospect, I realized that that very much played into and was a precursor to what happened on Christmas Day. Put together a certain kind of protocol, which I'm not going to tell people what it is because it's a bit dangerous if you do it the wrong way. But it was a protocol that put me into a very, very non-ordinary state. And as I said to you before we started recording, it was the wildest experience of my life, which, as you pointed out, is saying something because I've had some interesting experiences, to say the least. But that experience really helps reframe everything for me. It helps reframe how I think about the nature of reality, how I think about life and death. All of these things are directly impacted based on the revelations that arose in this experience, which was incredibly profound. Basically, to put it in a nutshell, I was taken out of this reality altogether in a way that I never have before. So, for instance, I've had experiences before, something like an OBE, but in some sense, energetically, I still felt tethered to my body. So I was exploring different domains, but still felt like it was coming out of home base here as Darren. But this experience, I was completely outside the construct altogether. In fact, the notion of Darren had no meaning anymore. But very interestingly, and this is spoken about in non-dual traditions, there was still a sense of I-ness. That feeling of presence was still there, but it was not connected to this notion of Darren, nor connected to the notion of living on Earth, being part of a family line made up of a certain group of people, that kind of thing. And when I came back in, I remember having a very, very distinct experience of none of this is real. And the way we think about it as being real is what I mean. And of course, you and I have talked about those kind of notions many, many times on this podcast as we've explored idealism and models like that. But this was like a direct experience of this that I've never had before, where similar to what people talk about with NDEs, where this feels much less real in comparison once they've had that experience, something like that. But I was fully cognizant of, directly aware of, in a kind of noetic way, that this is not really real. And to the degree to which it changes how I think about my life, changes how I think about what I want to do with my life, because it becomes more like an interesting idea that we are pursuing together as a collective. And then I ask myself, what's a more elegant, interesting, beautiful idea to pursue for the rest of this frame, this particular story, rather than thinking about it in some ultimate way. And when I say ultimate, what I mean there is that even when people entertain notions like idealism and are not afraid of death, when we look at our actions, we often still tell in ourselves in terms of how we live, how we focus on, I want to do this and then save up this much money and then do this kind of thing. How I think about the seasons of my life, what the rest of my life will look like, changed dramatically because of this. Because when you've had this direct experience, you can't help but take it less seriously, but that also frees you up to pursue some interesting ideas, some interesting experiences that you might not otherwise have thought about or considered. So for me, it was a really profound experience, happened on Christmas Day, and very much not only was sort of the climax of some events leading up to it, but as has been my experience, it further recontextualized elements of my life, historical moments in my life that I talked to you about. And in that sense, it's profound in the most expansive way I can possibly imagine. How was your Christmas?
I don't know about much to say to follow from that. You almost had like an Ebenezer Scrooge like visitation, just all these different elements of your life kind of presenting themselves to you in reformatted ways that have reframed your sense of reality, which I think is truly amazing and powerful. And um, my Christmas was far more mundane, but a wonderful time, spent with family, of course, and a nice time to slow down a little bit as well. I have had some recently interesting uh, experiences of synchronicity that were quite profound, at least for me anyway. Profound in the midst of a very mundane experience, and I find that those kinds of dichotomies to be particularly interesting. We can be going about doing things in our lives that are just very routine, very mundane, completely forgettable, even regrettable or unfortunate or annoying. And in the midst of these experiences, we can find this glimpse of this deeper meaning, and if we're paying attention to it, we're present to that. And that's kind of what happened to me. I had to go somewhere for an appointment, and I had some time on my hands, and I just basically surrendered myself to the universe in a sense, and just followed along whatever impulse kind of came along the way. And doing so, I ended up meeting all these new people who had interesting connections to my life, um, and it was just one after the other. It was like a bombardment of meaning synchronicity, right? Seeing synchronicity. So truly powerful. Um, and it does kind of fit neatly and nicely within this period that we're experiencing right now, which feels like a period of high strange activity. We're in this intense soup of the moment where there's just so much activity going on, so much interpretation taking place. People also have, generally speaking, at the end of the year, they have more time to be present to each other, to think, to contemplate, to reflect. And maybe even that means, unfortunately, in our society, more time looking at social media and kind of diving into all that material. And so there's this really swirling soup here of interesting experience and content that is, I think, assaulting us in a way, and bringing kind of new experiences bubbling out of that. And so it's a good time in a way, like, to match with your experience. It's a good time to have these non-ordinary states of experience, and to sort of see reality in ways that may be quite uncomfortable and unfamiliar. And I know we're going to talk a lot about that in terms of the content of the show. But I would say, before we even go down that path and think about where we are right now, think about the fact that this is true just regardless of what's happening. So just because we have an interesting time right now where there's a lot of things, quote unquote, taking place, doesn't mean that these insights can't be had in the less interesting times, so to speak. These truths, these realities are there, whether there are lights in the sky or there are not. And so, on that note, I know we want to talk about this latest activity to some degree, and kind of how that ties into the present moment, but not just the present, but really kind of the entire experience of being sort of incarnated as a human being, and what that's like now, and talking about time and causality and reality and all those kinds of things. So, where would you like to begin if we're going to talk about some of these phenomena, these lights in the sky, these orbs, and what they might represent?
Well, I did go into quite a bit of detail on the last Point of Convergence episode about what's been happening. And if people want kind of more of a historical replay of that, I would suggest they go listen to that episode. But in terms of what I would like us to explore, we want to sort of, I think, dial into what's happening most recently, as well as the really interesting overlay that we all bring as people with our worldviews, with our previous experience, with the possibility space that we're open to existing as we try to make sense of these things. Because even within ufology, there is quite a variance in terms of people how are looking at these things and what kind of information and data sets they're even willing to consider, which is fascinating in itself. But before we kind of get into some of that, I'm curious to hear your take on your personal experience of this, how you've tried to make sense of it yourself, how you've assimilated this information. I know that early on I sent you Bertie Jaworski's remote viewing reading of this and where she thinks it's going. And I remember you saying that was a wild ride. So when you think back to how you've made sense of this, tried to metabolize it yourself, what's your experience been like?
Well, it's been a roller coaster, to be honest. I think I identify a lot with those who look at this as purely like a societal contagion, as kind of a mass hysteria. There's a part of me that has that strong leaning, because if I'm not experiencing it myself, all I have is this material, this content, which is largely in the form of videos, which we already know that videos aren't very trustworthy sort of material as evidentiary material. But if I'm not experiencing it directly, it adds an extra layer where it's difficult for me to really get into this idea that something truly anonymous is happening. I mean, there's stuff happening in the sky, the night sky, all the time. And whether they be planes or stars, other life phenomena that just happen naturally. There's things that happen all the time. And if you just have more people that are looking up and kind of try to capture that, and then also we have this attention economy, right? So if I'm capturing something and I'm zooming in really close to it, and it looks like a distorted orb of light, and I want to post that on social media, and I would say like, oh, I saw this crazy craft and it's an orb, and it's whatever it may be, we generally can get attention from that, particularly if we phrase it the right way or gets the right boost from other influential accounts. So I've part of me approaches this entire flap, if you will, from that perspective of just maybe it's all crazy. Um, that said, there's a wholly other part of me that approaches it from the opposite end of the spectrum. And in particular, I mentioned on this podcast and some others, I had a very impactful dream when I was younger that involved orbs. This was long before I knew what orbs were, and talk of orbs and UFOs or UAP, anything like that. But it literally is still the most impactful dream experience I've ever had. And it involved, in part orbs in the sky, and also a man who I would say looks a lot like Chris Bledsoe or a lot like Dr. Joseph Burks, kind of that trim goatee kind of older man. And so when these things are taking place, in particularly these highly populated areas, and people are seeing these bizarre light phenomena, I mean, I'm bringing in that experience into this as well and say, well, wait a minute, maybe this resonates with me in some strange way that I can't explain. Um, then you couple that with all of the bizarre things that the official sources have stated, whether you have government officials from the Pentagon, whether you have mayors, police department officials, all of these conflicting statements that there is something to it. No, it's all mundane and prosaic. The messaging has been absolutely horrible. And, it shows you just how vulnerable we are, I think, as a society, and how much we have maybe overinflated our capability to identify what is in the sky. And you have a messaging component of that as a government to try to project competence, right? That we know what this is. Everybody go back to sleep. It's all fine. We've got our arms around this. It's no big deal. But then in social media, you've got other authoritative figures saying, whoa, hold on there. It can't just be what you're saying, because, I'm a mayor or whatever. It's literally over my house right now. It's the size of an SUV. Like, this is not a plane. I see planes all the time. So you combine all these factors, and I think you can't help but come away and think something truly strange is taking place. You've got all this activity, both in the U.S. and throughout the world, it seems, some other places as well. So I've been on quite a journey with all of this. And I think in some respects where I've finally landed is that the strangeness, the confusion, the misdirection, if you will, is part of the picture. It's meant to confound. It's meant to disorient us and shake us out of our maybe sort of routine experiences of reality. It's meant to kind of impact or confront that. and say, you don't really know what's going on, and the government doesn't really know what's going on, and there are mysteries still in the world. And what are those mysteries? And they don't have easy explanations, and that's the point. There aren't easy explanations. So, long answer to your question, but that's kind of been my journey with all of this.
Yeah, I think that what I would add to that is that the ambiguity is deliberate, right? Is another way to say that. And what I mean by that is not just that literally the phenomena in the sky could be one thing or it could be another, and I'll get to why that's the case in a minute. But because I think that there is something anomalous that is involved here, along with some things that are prosaic, but the overall picture is convoluted deliberately so that people who are ready to take the leap into a new paradigm can do so. There's enough evidence to persuade them of that. But those who are not ready, because they're so wedded to their worldview that ignores these kinds of things, it's not so overwhelming that they will have no choice. So some people have suggested, and I think there's something to this, that the intelligence behind this is creating a kind of catastrophic disclosure, but it's doing it kind of in a slow burn kind of way, so as not to create massive shock to the system and massive shock to individuals ontologically and otherwise. So I think that's a big part of what's going on here. And now to dive into some of the detail, let's unpack a bit about what's being seen and why this notion that there's something truly anomalous in the mix keeps showing up. So one person pointed out on social media that there's a distinct optical pattern and lensing effect to the objects that do appear anomalous, and that you can easily tell the difference when you use a spectrometer. And apparently even Lou Elizondo and Graves have talked about this actually, and that they have come out publicly and said they do think there's things that are anomalous here. Elizondo has literally said there are the 5 observables noticed here. Now, of course, something that you touched on there that's really interesting is noticing the government flip-flopping. And this is another data point I think we should pay attention to, not just what the government's saying, but how what they say changes over time based on public response. So first of all, we saw this kind of dismissive comment that this is a lot of misidentification going on, that there's a lot of traffic in the sky. Much of this is actually manned craft that's operating lawfully. And on top of that, we've got something like 1 million drones across the country. People are just happening to look up and see them for the first time and thinking this is some sort of alien invasion like War of the Worlds or something. But of course, people pushed back on that. And there's one particular press conference I remember, this one reporter from Fox News, she pushed back and said, help this make sense. Because we have people, like you said, mayors, governors even, seeing these things about their house, and not just seeing them lower than they should be based on safety concerns, you would think, but on top of that, behaving sometimes in anomalous ways, not making sound or looking like a traditional aircraft, but something's off about it. For people who are astute observers and know what they're looking for. Again, what's interesting about that is that it makes you ask the question without forcing you to a conclusion, which I think is interesting in itself, right? So when you've watched the government response, what are your takes on how you think they're trying to metabolize what's going on? What have you taken away from this in terms of what you think they think this is?
Well, it clearly shows not everyone's on the same page, and that's true within the federal government, that not everyone's on the same page. You've got different statements from the Pentagon than you might have from the White House. From the FBI, of course, was involved as well, giving some different statements to what's happening, that they just don't know what it is. And then you've got local officials with other interpretations as well. I think that speaks to the confounding nature of it. And we know, if you've been following this topic for some time now, we know that these objects, whatever they might be, have been sighted over other places in the past. And I'm not just talking about historical flaps like air shows. I'm just talking about within the last year. We know that there were objects that disrupted an Air Force base that, they don't know what they were. It was the same time of the year and last year. And so, you have this pattern, this continuing pattern of odd behavior, and they seem unable to do anything about it. They can't detect what they are. They can't stop what they are. They can't track what they are, which I think the public, rightly so, thinks is ridiculous. I mean, most of the talking heads who are asked about what they think is happening, or does the government, do you really believe the government? Most of the popular talking heads say, no, of course, I don't believe what the government's saying. How could they not know what these are with our sophisticated technology, the persistent imagery that we have, over the globe? I think that's a good point. So it does speak to the truly confounding quality of these experiences, and I think the government trying to sort of stumble towards some cohesive message that is in a way kind of almost optimistic. Like if we say it enough times, then it will be true. If we say we've got our arms around this and we've put in some no-fly zones, and it's just, these are hobbyist drones. If we say this enough on TV, then it'll just hopefully go away like it did last December, and then we don't have to worry about that anymore. The problem this time is it seems that it's not really going away. I mean, I've seen accounts as recently as yesterday of these kinds of objects. So truly interesting as this unfolds. And I also, just before turning it back to you, I tend to think about, what is it that we don't know? So, any of our listeners who've had experiences with anomalous, objects in the sky, there typically are other components to that experience beyond just the visual sighting. There are often associated phenomena that come along with that, whether they be personal encounters, or strange visions or dreams, or other strange things that begin happening around that individual's life. And so these are the more anomalous kinds of experiences that officials aren't going to talk about at all, because this falls into that absolutely bizarre bucket that their credibility would be shot if they were to talk about them. So I wonder how much of that is taking place, if any. And I'm purely speculating here, but there's a lot of really important people who've spoken about this, who've said these objects have been really close to their houses. That makes me wonder, are there things that they aren't sharing that they've experienced that could also be laying some groundwork, some foundation for how this might unfold going forward?
Yeah, some good points there for me to touch on as well. One is this notion of the government saying they don't know what it is. That in itself is really amazing when you think about it, because for us being, the most formidable military in the world, and yet saying literally, there's things in our sky, we don't know what they are, but there's no evidence they pose a national security risk or a personal risk. Now, of course, what people have pointed out, even some elected officials like Gillibrand pointed this out, that doesn't mean that they know it's not. They're just saying they have no evidence it is a threat. And that alone is not very encouraging for people, not very soothing to people who are seeing these things. And when you're watching some of these videos, you can hear people's concern. You can hear how it's making them nervous. They're like, what is that? It's really low. And they're concerned about the fact that the government is just letting it happen. So we went from them at first saying there's nothing to see here, to then when they're pushed, acknowledging there is something to see here, but there's no sign of it being a threat. But as you pointed out, when you actually have Wright-Patterson Air Force Base being shut down because of these things, then it takes it to a whole new level. And as Elizondo pointed out, and I quoted him in that POC episode, you just don't do that for commercial or hobby drones. You just don't do it. But at the same time, the government's come out and said, no, we don't think it's those things, but we also don't think it's adversarial drones either. And this is really fascinating, because that begs the question, then what other options are on the table? And this leads me to believe that the government is at least beginning to see the possibility of something anomalous, something that is not one of the usual players. Perhaps because they're convinced at this point that they better start putting that on the table so they have some control of the narrative if this does escalate. A little bit later, I want to get into the different scenarios about where we go from here, that being one of them, that it escalates. But let me touch on a couple other things that relate to things you said. So, yes, not only do people have, for instance, telepathic contact with these objects, but sometimes what we're seeing in some of these videos is people speaking to the orbs, for instance, they see, and with a plain eye, you can see these things seeming to shake, vibrate differently, seemingly in response to the person. So we've heard many times people having testimonials speaking to this kind of thing, but now we have videos out there that demonstrate this, and that alone is fascinating. Another thing that is a data point that many people will not consider, including people within ufology, especially the more nuts and bolts crowd, and that is the fact that visitation contact experiences are also up. That's been my anecdotal experience from people that are reaching out to me, but I've heard it from other people who work with a lot of experiencers and run experiencer forums, that they're hearing from brand new people who are having their first experiences, who are feeling very shook up by it, very confused ontologically, who are showing up for the first time in greater numbers than they've seen previously. And my sense all along, related to a download I had a couple of years ago, was that some sort of mass contact would initially show up as mass telepathic contact. And what's interesting is I think you can see that data point developing as we speak. But again, I also think there's just enough ambiguity that's being let out there that people aren't forced to go there if they're not ready to. And I think that actually suggests perhaps even some concern, some care, some awareness about the psychological process people go through. Something else I want to touch on here is the 5 observables and how that is sometimes ambiguous as well. Because, for instance, I saw this one video that showed an orb acting strangely. What I mean by an orb, of course, is a circle in the sky, right, that's lit up. And the thing's blinking in, blinking out. And then what you see with the naked eye is it blink out and suddenly appear quite a bit up and to the left in the frame one more time and then disappear altogether. Now, one person said, here's an example of instantaneous acceleration. We have one of the 5 observables on camera. But of course, the challenge is that's ambiguous because there's a degree of interpretation there. Someone else pointed out, no, that's just 2 orbs. One blinks out and another orb, that same shape, shows up in the top left of the sky of the frame of the camera. And of course, we don't know, because part of the challenge is what we're seeing is this high contrast of bright lights against a dark backdrop of a sky, and the rest is left to the mind to interpret what you're seeing. There was another example where there was an object that looked like maybe a drone because there's a few different lights, green and red, which shows up a lot, which, by the way, was part of a remote viewing exercise we'll get into later. But then it looked like there was an orb, a white orb, circling this drone. And one person actually said, this is clearly what this is. And someone else said, no, I've seen drones that basically have another drone tethered to them with a string you can't see. So basically, it's just circling. It's one object. It just looks like 2 because of the way the lights show up. So again, that's ambiguous, which to some people is frustrating. But on the other hand, again, if there's a mass psychological operation underway on behalf of non-human intelligence, perhaps, then this, again, in the ambiguity, lets those who are ready begin to consider those possibilities, but those who are not, there's not enough evidence to convince them. So fascinating. And just want to turn it over to you for one more reflection on that before we get into the different takes within ufology itself. But what do you think about as you observe the ambiguity and the different interpretations that arise as a result?
Yeah, I tend to think that the ambiguity is the point, and that the fact that these things take place at night, which is often very, very frustrating, I mean, for everyone, I think, because it is difficult to capture quality video or even photos of these objects, even by professionals. It's very difficult at night to capture these objects. That's partly the point. It's a real challenge. And I also think as well, just to talk about the psychological aspect of it, if you are trying to, again, very speculative here, but if I think there is an NHI component, if you're trying to acclimate people to whatever this might be or to strangeness that they're not familiar with, the nighttime is actually a pretty good time to do that. That it is more ambiguous. It does require more interpretive sort of generosity. You have to kind of fill in the gaps, and on top of that, just as human beings, being the biological creatures that we are, the end of the day is where we kind of try to wind down. We're not like amped, ready to go and take action immediately. At the end of the day, we're ready to sort of drift off to sleep into dreamland, right? So having these things take place at that time of the day is also beneficial for us, because it's just the impact is perhaps a little bit less jarring. So, I want as much clarity as everybody else. I'm looking forward to more evidence that we can hang our hats on. But I think if you take all of the things that we've heard and you put all of the pieces on the table here, the picture is pretty bizarre. There's no good explanation. Like the mass hysteria explanation doesn't work on its own, given all of the other components that are a part of this story. So yeah, I'm eager to see where we go, and I recognize that we're really we're at a transitional period. Think about that as well. We're at a transitional period from one year to another, right? We just went through a winter solstice, another transitional period. We're going through a different administration in the United States, another transitional period. There's heightened, tensions and war and that kind of thing. These are all sort of gateways, initiatory gateways of life that we're approaching. So very interesting timing.
Speaking of the video that's been captured, some people have pointed out, I think astutely, that while we assume that if the Phoenix Lights were to happen today, we would have all this great evidence and it would be very clear what's going on, we're finding that actually that's not the case, because even though we do have these high-powered smartphones, all of us, and we have massive amounts of footage that's being shot, we find that actually iPhones and Androids don't do so well when pointing in the distance against something that's lit up brightly. And sometimes how it focuses or doesn't focus changes what you think you're seeing with the naked eye. So some people have even pointed out that some people who are saying they're photographing or videoing a drone or an orb specifically actually are tuning into a star somewhere or Venus or something. And it just looks the same when you kind of are out of focus. So it gets really tricky because, again, unless we have the metadata, we don't really know what's happening. And people don't necessarily think about those things when they're putting these things together. But as we get into interpreting what this means, I think one thing we have to sort of step away here and recognize, regardless of your interpretation, is this is confounding and potentially disturbing if you think it is something more prosaic, because what would the options therefore be? Because the government is not able, apparently, to take these things down. We heard, for instance, that finally when the federal government began listening to the local mayors and governors who are saying, please, you need to do something here, saying there's nothing to see here is not appropriate, they actually created no-fly zones for some parts of New Jersey and whatnot, and yet the things were still up there night after night. What does that say? Why are we not addressing this? Really, really fascinating, because if it's not ours, then that makes most people that think in conventional terms think this must be, of course, adversarial drones. And it makes us look like our military has no teeth to be able to stop these things. The other possibility that I entertained on POC that some people have put forward is that maybe this means that the government knows darn well this is the Chinese or the Russians, but their concern is by acknowledging that would be to acknowledge the fact that basically this is a provocation equal to an act of war, and that we're much, much closer to World War III than the general public realizes, and that our government is just buying time in a diplomatic way to try to prevent that from happening, which in itself is kind of terrifying. But again, to your point, there's just anomalies that don't seem to fit well with that. And it's hard to imagine that the most, again, formidable military in the world would just sit back and say, we don't know what they are, but they're not seemingly hurting anybody, so just put up with it, people. That just seems like a really, really strange response. It's hard to imagine how that seems legitimate in any sense, regardless of how you make sense of this scenario. Okay, so within ufology, you're getting different takes as well, which is interesting. You're getting some people who are saying this is all human conventional drones, nothing to see here. But again, the data itself, I think, challenges that notion. You're also getting some people putting forward the notion that this is a black op of some kind, that these are next generation conventional vehicles, either run by the military knowingly, or some rogue element of the military that's broken off and is conducting this exercise, and that this rogue group might have technology that is so much more powerful and formidable than what our standard military has. And therefore, our own military is basically toothless in the face of this other entity, which actually is human, but a break-off kind of civilization or rogue element of the military. You also have the idea that there's some UAP mimicking drones, of course. So in other words, there would be drones up there, but you have UAP mimicking drones. This has been part of the historic lore. We know this has happened, so this would not be the first time. And then you have some people saying that there are drones up there to investigate or to obscure the presence of the orbs, right? Some people are saying the orbs are the main entree on the menu, and the presence of the drones is just meant to distract people, confuse the picture, so people don't recognize how anomalous the orbs actually are. Another possibility that's been floated is that you have signs of an escalating Cold War between different factions of NHI. And so the presence of these things in the sky, and there have been a few videos, you might have seen them, of what looks like something being shot at something else, Again, it's hard to tell what's going on because we just see lights moving, some lights reacting. How we interpret whether or not something just shot at something else and forced it down is a different question. So again, depending on your pre-existing worldview, you might look at those things differently. And then, of course, speaking of the orbs versus the drones, we have the notion of some of these might not be aliens, but angels. So we have this notion that comes up a lot within ufology. You and I, of course, are more on the consciousness train, but there are some people within that want to interpret the consciousness presence in a more traditional kind of religious lens, and therefore call them angels, and would appeal to religious history to help us understand how this has happened in the past. And I know that both you and I watched a couple of recent documentaries, both covering the nuclear component and that tie-in with this, but also religious history and that kind of thing, and esoteric versus exoteric knowledge. So I want to get into that as well. But when you hear people voicing the question, are these angels or aliens, what's your initial response to that? We're going to get into some of the details and how to unpack that further. But how do you, as a person who's familiar with the UFO phenomenon, but someone who also has studied religious history, how do you make sense of that when you hear people opting for one of those two sort of binary options?
Yeah, it's all about the frameworks, right? It's all about the frameworks that we bring to these experiences, and that's something that is right at the front of my mind when I hear people talk about this, and it tells me more honestly what the interpretations give me is more information about the person than actually the whatever it is. So I know more about what that individual is like than I do about the object that they're perceiving. If they're telling me it's angels and demons, well, that gives me an insight into the framework that they're bringing to the experience. Um, if they're telling me that it's just drones in the sky, another framework to the experience. If they're telling me it's airplanes, all these different things tell me more about what the person's background is than what the experience actually is. The angels and demons in particular, I think that's really fascinating. Because there is a component in the human history, human experience, where we have interpreted lights in the sky from those kinds of frameworks. But as you and I have talked about quite a bit in other episodes, the 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 angel and the demon are basically very amorphous kinds of concepts throughout time. Like they're not none of these like locked in. I mean, if you think about angel and demon right now, you're thinking about this sort of stereotypical bright white, being with a bright white robe and huge wings. This is an angel. You're thinking about a demon. You're thinking of something that has that's probably red or dark or has horns or a tail or goat-like perhaps. I mean these are things that we just stereotypically associate with that. So but these two concepts aren't necessarily what they have always been conceived of throughout history, these angels and demons. So I get pretty frustrated, and we had somebody, in fact, one of our recent Calling All Beings episodes, somebody was in the audience and they were talking about, that this is definitely angels and demons, and like we just need to get past it's not ETs, it's not aliens, it's definitely angels and demons from the Bible. The Bible talked about angels and demons and didn't talk about aliens, right? So so it's a very limited framework of perceiving this. But what makes it even more difficult, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit, is just how many talking heads in this space are talking about angels and demons, that they don't really do any unpacking of it. They kind of just distill it down to that, and they kind of conflate it all to that, and then they're letting you do the work. They're giving you this little packet, and they're letting you do the unpacking about whatever that means to you. And I think it's unfortunate because it creates a lot of ambiguity in the interpretive space that isn't, in my opinion, particularly helpful.
Right, and there's much to say about this angels and demons versus aliens framing, and we will return to that a little bit later. So that's a early foray into that. But before we go fully into that, because I think it's a really interesting conversation, and it has basically dominated social media. And as, for instance, X/Twitter has moved towards the right, we're seeing that presented as a way to frame this more and more, much more than we used to, actually. And we have to be aware of those movements even within our society. But something I wanted to get into first was the question about where this goes from here and how we begin to even ask that question. What kind of data do we consider when we try to entertain that question? So we mentioned earlier Bertie Jaworski's remote viewing of this, where she basically saw that there was an intelligence that was non-human, but not the typical humanoid type. Non-human as in reptilians, the Greys, the Mantis types, the Nordics, etc., but a kind of disembodied quantum scale kind of intelligence that could manifest physical objects in our 3D space. That's what she basically perceived, and that this was their way of beginning to interact with us because they had concerns about the state of our civilization, which of course is a major question here. If this is happening and if it does involve NHI, why now? So according to her, this is because we are at a crux point in our civilization. And if there isn't some sort of intervention, we are going to go down perhaps a self-destructive path, which, as I pointed out in POC, I don't think is hard for any of us to imagine that possibility based on the state of the world as it is right now. So she said basically they are interacting with us, slowly going to increase their presence, and that they have concerns about the way we conduct our affairs in terms of how some people have so little, some people have so much, also our relationship to the planet, and that fundamentally, as I pointed out in POC, the problem arises from this illusion of separation, that we've lost our connection to the oneness of everything. We've lost that unit of experience. And because of that, we're making all these decisions that are leading down self-destructive paths, inevitably because we're not in touch with what truly really is. Now, in addition, we have the Farsight Institute, and Courtney Brown leads that institute. And he has also given his own remote viewing take on what's happening. And he also says that there are NHI involved, absolutely. But he also points out that there's kind of a war going on, what has been mostly a Cold War from our point of view up till now, between the, quote, good ETs and the bad ETs, right? This will factor into what we're talking about later in terms of angels, demons, binary framings of good and bad, good and evil. I had an experience that was part of my really mind-blowing experience that happened on Christmas Day that helped give me a interesting insight on that particular question. But what he was predicting would come next is basically we would go from drones and orbs, relatively small vehicles. The largest you've heard talked about is SUV size kind of vehicles. But he's saying we would begin to see much larger craft. And this absolutely was the onset of catastrophic disclosure. But of course, you and I both know that some people don't even consider remote viewing as a valid way to gain data about the situation. So this question about where we go from here is interesting because some people will say this is just going to end up like your typical flap that has happened before. And by the way, just for people who don't know, a flap means a sudden onset of a lot of UFOs in a short period of time. This has happened before, and in those times it tended to fade away. That prompts interesting questions about why. So one possibility is that this fades away, right? Another possibility is that it doesn't. But when it first comes to this question of what data should we consider to even begin to answer that question potentially, what do you think about remote viewing? And maybe you could even be honest about your own process over time and how much right now for Nathan in 2024 going into 2025 versus Nathan from, say, 2020, how seriously do you take that information and how much does it play a role in determining what you think is going to happen?
Yeah, well, I definitely take it a lot more seriously now than I ever did in the past. And that's in part because I've had my own experiences of precognition that have been eerily true through just altered states of consciousness. And so if you've had an experience like that, you then have to, I think, make space for what we call remote viewing, that it is a kind of, perception, a sense of perception that we possess, that that is just like an atrophied muscle, that we're not using it, but it's there. And so I do give it a lot more credence than I ever did. But I also think it's not one of those things that functions in a, sort of precise way, that it is very interpretive, just like an experience is interpretive, which talk about frameworks, right? So the remote viewer, when they're sensing, picking up information, well, they're spitting it out through their framework of interpretation. So you're getting what they think it represents. And, if they keep that, this is where we get frustrated by it too. If they keep that information too broad and vague, I'm getting this feeling, I'm getting this kind of shape, and it's very, not very specific. Then we go, well, I mean, that could be anything, whatever they're saying, like any future experience, I could just retroactively fit it into whatever they were saying and see that, look, they were predicting the future, right? But that's the problem. Like we can't accurately predict in the way that we might want to be able to do so, and that really frustrates us. But there is this sense in which the felt experience is resonant and true. And I definitely feel more aligned with the felt sense of the future rather than the precise nature of it. That there are kind of like ripples through space-time of events that kind of hit us in waves, and we have an approximation of what those things are. We don't have a specific, high fidelity version of what that thing might be. And so if it doesn't happen tomorrow, it may happen, a month, a year, 2 years from now. So yeah, it's definitely a different place than I had before. I'm making more space for it than I ever had before. But I also recognize that we're these individuals who do this, they're fallible just like you and I, and they're bringing a lot of their own perspective to that interpretation.
Yeah, this is something that people are not taking into account that they really need to, and that is that this is not information received in a vacuum. And because of that, that means that they will inevitably not only interpret this through their grid, but on top of that, there are ways that they will actually alter the information that's coming in because they're adding their own distortion to the mix as well. So when people, for instance, say, hey, Darren, check this out. This one group remote viewed this. This is what's happening. I would say, well, that's not only just their interpretation of what's happening, but on top of that, there's likely distortion mixed in too. And as I have talked about on different podcast episodes with channeling, for instance, we know that some people are better channelers than others, not just because some have a raw talent that's greater than others, but because some people are cleaner vessels, so the information comes through more cleanly. So this is something people have to consider. And when I, for instance, listen to someone who's sharing a remote viewing session, I pay attention to what I'm picking up from that person. And there's a lot of information that's on the surface, and there are also impressionistic, energetic patterns that I also pick up about them. And then I also factor that into my impression of how valid they are likely being, or how much they are themselves accounting for their distortion. Because if they're not accounting for their distortion, it's inevitably going to end up bleeding in to their account itself and their interpretation of the account. So I, for instance, would say personally, I have quite a bit of faith in Bertie Jaworski's remote viewing. I know that she's done this for decades, and I see evidence that she's working to account for her distortions, correct for some of those distortions. And as I was talking to you before we went on the air here, this really comes down to very granular, subtle levels of reality, and we need to do the work along with other people who can become mirrors for us for things we don't see ourselves, so that we are clearing that field as much as possible. And in that, then we get a much more succinct and clean reading of what's happening. Something else I want to point out here that Bertie has argued for, and I think this is actually accurate, and this points to what you're saying about an atrophied kind of muscle, that her experiences in retrospect after decades, although she didn't see this at first, but in retrospect, she talks about basically everyone gets this right when they remote view things. But what we pick up and why we pick it up is also partly determined by who we are and our experience and our history. And so the trick becomes not just what we pick up impressionistically, but how we can notice that's what we're picking up and how it is attached to the actual result. Because as many of you will know, a key part of remote viewing is you have to, after the fact, compare it to the actual target and see if it's valid or not. You just don't do it with things you can't validate. Of course, this is tricky here because we can't ask the NHR or whatever they are to show up so we can compare this to the actual deal. But this is something that's key. So that's something people need to be aware of, is that actually everyone does have this skill, but learning how your particular configuration of your personhood tends to see the future and experience it is part of the process of cleaning and determining where the valid intel actually is. So that's interesting in itself. So everybody can do this, some people to a greater degree than others, and some people are much cleaner vessels based on the work they've done when they're in these kind of processes. All right, so with that said about remote viewing, we talked about one scenario where there's been these suggestions from these remote viewers that this is going to increase. And that means that this basically is the onset of ontological shock and the onset of catastrophic disclosure. But let's talk about three different scenarios I can think of in terms of where this is going to go from here. And we're going to be neutral, we're going to be impartial, and entertain each one, because I don't think either Nathan and I would say that we have a clear sense that it's absolutely going to go one way or another. And history would suggest that we should be cautious about doing that, because there have been times before, either where flaps happened and people thought for sure this was the end of the world or the beginning of mass contact, or people thought it was the end days or whatever, right? We're very familiar with that history. So if indeed this does involve some degree of NHI and they are ramping things up, the question is, where does this go from here? Scenario one is that this ends the same way that other historic flaps will end, which means that it will fade away, fade out of existence, and eventually go outside of the awareness of the general public. So Nathan, for you, when you think about that scenario, how likely does that seem? How does it fit with your sense of where things are going to go from here?
Well, I'm gonna put myself out there and say I think it's going to increase. I don't think it's likely to fade away. And the reason why I say that is, and I mean that in the sense it may not increase, sort of week to week to week, but I think it's going to increase maybe in overall frequency if we step back and look at it from a kind of a larger time frame. In part because more people are now open to this as a possibility, and I think that personally, I believe that reality is very participatory, and those that are participating in reality with this expectation are more likely to see it. And that means that it's more likely to be there. So I do think it's going to increase, maybe more so than flaps of the past, because people, I think, are more willing to entertain that it's real, that it's possible. That on top of that, the fact that the government doesn't seemingly have their arms around whatever this is, and so it's not a one and done. We can just sort of close the book on it. We've caught the perpetrator, everybody, and case closed. I don't see that happening, and so this, in my opinion, seems to be increasing and will continue to increase.
Yeah, when you think about comparing this to some other historic flaps, if you will, involving cattle mutilation, right, where we have certain parts of the country, other parts of other countries like Canada, where there's been an increase of frequency of cattle being mutilated, that has created situations where the cattle farmers themselves and the police looking into it are confused, they're perplexed. And as people like George Knapp, I think, has pointed out, we have never seen any of those cases come to a resolution. There's obviously a small percentage of them that are being done by human beings, some by wild animals, but the most anomalous ones that have the really precise, almost laser-like cuts, and it doesn't seem to fit with either human perpetrators or animal ones, those ones have never been solved. But they're not happening with enough frequency, and they're not impacting people directly enough in the general public that it garners enough attention to be something that we demand answers around. This is a bit different, right? Because this is happening over people's houses. They feel some degree of threat. They are demanding answers from the government. And so that's something I would introduce as a factor here. I think an interesting variable will be how much will the general public demand that this be addressed in a way it's not been addressed so far. So the first scenario we entertained there was the fact that it just fades out. Nathan chimed in to say he doesn't think it's going to. I don't think it is either, although exactly where it goes from here is not completely clear to me. And there's also a long history of NHI giving certain predictions themselves or certain prophecies about what's going to happen, and it doesn't happen quite that way. Now, there might be numerous reasons why that is the case, not just that they are malevolent. It could be a kind of Zen koan of its own, or perhaps factors on the ground change what their response was going to be. But we're saying that scenario one seems unlikely to us, although it's obviously a possibility. Scenario two, actually, that I considered is that it doesn't ramp up and it doesn't fade away, but it kind of stays the same as it is now, where we don't see a fall-off of interest, or maybe we do, but the actual frequency, intensity of these things showing up is the same. So I saw one person respond kind of in an interesting way when he talked about how he is day after day tuning in and seeing new footage of drones and orbs. He's finding his interest kind of fall off a little bit because he's becoming desensitized to it. That may be happening to the public in general. And the question then becomes, what if it's not that these things go away, but they stay the same and they're not attacking anybody, And eventually people just go, oh yeah, there's the drones and the orbs, to the point where maybe we have a generation that grows up with that doesn't even remember a time where that was not the case. That seems unlikely, but that's one possibility, that they just stay up there and people eventually either lose interest or become desensitized to it, because we know people have busy lives. They are worried about many other things right now in our civilization, and it might just not rise to a fever pitch where it demands a response from our government. Of course, then there's scenario 3, which is that this grows in intensity, either in frequency or it spreads to more places. And I've seen, for instance, certain maps of the globe that have tracked where this is happening, and it has spread around the world. Although it's interestingly connected to nuclear installations often, not just nuclear weapons facilities, but also nuclear energy plants as well, which raises further questions and concerns about what that might mean. But when you think about scenario 3, and you just sort of check yourself, what is your response? Because I've seen some people wrestle with this on social media, people who've been part of ufology and UFO Twitter for years now, saying out loud to each other, this is really happening, right? Like, this is actually going on. We are experiencing the beginning of disclosure, and it's catastrophic. It's being led by NHI, or perhaps by NHI alongside some rogue group that's pushing disclosure, pushing the government to show their hand. But when you think about your experience of that, what Nathan's life's going to look like a year from now, 2 years from now, what our civilization's going to look like in light of these incursions, how do you wrestle with that?
Yeah, it's really tough. And if you're immersed in this space, you know that there are some, to be honest, some frightening scenarios that you might play out with this idea here, this growing intensity idea. And I certainly entertained those. That we may be on the cusp of a real sea change in human civilization, and that could be catastrophic in its own right, whether that involves literal catastrophe and loss of life, or just the catastrophic impact to our worldview and to our way of thinking and being. To some degree, almost, there's a part of me, and I think I feel this energy in, in Western society anyway, for sure, that there's almost a welcoming of that type of catastrophe. Like we've reached a point in our society where we can't seem to solve some of these really intractable problems that we have. And the divide continues to grow between the haves and the have-nots. The climate is continuing to change in ways that create a lot of, disruption in our way of life. And, there's a sense in which maybe we can't solve these problems on our own. So we might need something to help us solve those problems, whether that be a kind of governmental change. You're seeing kind of this rise in populism, that just maybe just these new voices who have control over the government maybe will step in, and they'll get rid of the corruption, they'll fix the problems, and they'll even if it might take a sledgehammer to some of our institutions, like the end result will be better than where we are right now, because what we've done up to this point just isn't working. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's AI that will come along, and the AI will point out glaring, obvious flaws in how we do whatever we do, whether it be work or energy or governmental relations or whatever, and we'll be more willing to take those insights and put those into action. Or maybe perhaps even the AI will put those into action on our behalf if it becomes powerful enough. And there's a sense in which we are ready, in a way, we are primed for, if I could distill this down, to a kind of savior, some type of savior to fix the wrongs that appear to be in the world today. So, I definitely leave space for that as a possibility in the future, that it could be a radically different world a year from now or 2 years from now or whatever. That and even drones in the sky, lights in the sky. I've had that sense for quite some time, that this decade in particular was going to be unlike maybe any decade that has ever been in human history. So there's a lot of change that is coming our way. And I think when it comes to this notion of, contact, what I worry about the most is that we're really overlaying so much of these, of a sort of classic ET narrative onto these lights in the sky, that what if it doesn't unfold that way, right? What if there is no mothership and there aren't beings from the Galactic Federation. It's not just playing out like we would want it to play out in a movie. What if it's much more ambiguous, complicated, frustrating even? What if the strangeness only increases, right? Well, then how do we make sense of that? Because what that would mean for us is that the paradigms and notions that we have about how things should go forward are going to break. And that then means we have to re-examine a lot of the assumptions that we've brought to this moment to begin with, what got us here. And maybe those assumptions are really wrong. And we have to rethink so much about how we understand the world. And that is a massive undertaking, a catastrophe in its own right.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's numerous points to get into here. And we definitely want to unpack this alien versus angel kind of notion, this dichotomy, and talk about some things that Carl Nell brought up, for instance, in a recent conversation to help show how the reality might be much more complex than this, just based even on some of the physicalist notions. We'll get to that in a second. But before we go there, I want to play out more how this might impact our society. And you raised an interesting point there that many people feel like the concerns we have, the challenges we're facing are so intractable, so daunting, that they'd rather blow up the system or have some sort of outside force come in and force change because they are no longer convinced that we have the capacity ourselves to, and that some people are convinced we will self-destruct if we don't have some sort of intervention. So even though there's a lot of ambiguity and concern about what that intervention might look like, many people are open to it just because they're convinced the status quo will not work and it will result in self-destruction. Now, you and I, of course, did a previous podcast episode where we've looked at different scenarios about how this would play out. What's interesting now, of course, though, is that we're seeing this happen in real time. And so what we're imagining is if it rolls out from here, what might that look like? Because one factor that comes to mind here is we talked about the impact on financial markets, for instance, in a previous podcast episode. And it's possible, at least, theoretically, that this intelligence could continue to do the slow burn in such a way that it doesn't panic the markets. And maybe that's even part of their calculus. Because we talked before about if there's a sudden disclosure or a sudden catastrophic showing up of these things, catastrophic to our worldview, for instance, our sense of stability, sense of that which is predictable, that would inevitably make the markets tank. People would pull resources out of the markets, and you'd have the whole spiral that happens then. But maybe this is going to happen in a very calculated way so as to not let that happen. But of course, another question that arises here, or issue that arises, is the notion of capitalism and markets as they exist now something we need to keep? Is it something that is endemic of the problem in general? And therefore, as some people I think are wishing for, and you kind of hinted at this, they'd rather blow up the entire thing and start from scratch. And maybe if we have this really intelligent species alongside us who seem to be able to, if Birdie is right in terms of this remote viewing, basically create manifest objects from the quantum vacuum that takes no need of resources or anything like that, then of course that changes everything. You have free energy and you have free matter, basically, that you can create anything you want. You talked earlier about your son and his 3D printer. Well, this is to a whole different degree, orders of magnitude greater than that. So when you think about that, what's happening now and where it might go from here, maybe give some feedback on the markets being one, how that might impact things if it rolls out slowly. There's also the impact on religious people and atheistic people, or people who are coming more from a scientific paradigm. And Carl Nell, of course, spoke about that in terms of it's one thing to have a religious affiliation and believe that at one point in history, a long time ago, these things used to happen. And even maybe have in the back of your mind, some part of your worldview is that these things do exist. But it's a whole different matter when you're confronted with it, when they show up in your room, for instance. And then you think about these matters in an entirely different way. And it's ontologically shocking, even if you already kind of believe it's true in kind of an abstract way. When it's in your face, it's entirely different. So what are some of the ways you think about those different aspects or different sectors of our society and how they will be impacted?
Yeah, so the markets are really an immune response for a specific kind of organism, right? So the markets that we have today respond pretty rapidly to events that take place in the world. And that's because there are lots of people with lots of money who are looking to make more money. And so anything that happens, anything transpires that is a big enough event, whether it be the birth of a new technology or maybe the devastation of a certain kind of crop, there are people who are always looking to leverage that event to make money out of it. And they do that very, very quickly. I mean, either they're doing it consciously or we even have developed some highly sophisticated algorithms that will do that instantaneously. So the markets are a kind of rapid immune response to our global civilization, the way that civilization looks right now. I think that if this continues to roll out more slowly, we'll see that market response. We'll continue to see it, but the ways I would expect to see it, if I were to say just traditional responses, would be things like investment in technology, investment in defense, certainly. That there would be a lot of personal investment taking place at the individual household level in those same kinds of things, because we fear the unknown. So, maybe more people will buy guns and ammo, and they'll store more food. They'll be more cautious about leaving the house because, well, in the house I feel safe, perhaps. So there's a lot of things that will happen, these behavioral changes that will take place both macroscopically and microscopically in the economy at large, that will move the market, and that is an evolving response. It's not something that's sort of a one and done. It evolves over time. And that, if you're an NHI and you recognize that, if you have the sophistication enough to recognize that that's the way that this human civilization functions, well, what levers do you pull on? What ways do you interact that try to leave the most minimal impact on that as possible? I think that's the real question I would have. If you're an NHI that has a sort of, again, speaking very traditionally here about the good NHI or the bad, right? Then you're going to behave in a way that softens the blow as much as possible, or if you have malevolent intent, creates the most amount of havoc as possible, so that human beings can't be organized and can't do what they need to do, and they may end up really kind of fighting each other, right? But that's a very classic conception of this type of contact, and that's something we all see a lot of right now. Is that you hear a lot of the narratives, the benevolent AI NHIs are on their way, or this is right. They're preparing the battlefield. This is one that I read all the time. They're preparing the battlefield for the arrival of their motherships. These are their scout ships who are looking at our nuclear installations and trying to figure out what our defenses are, so they can disable them before the real sort of presence arrives. I mean, these are really classic, traditional, very anthropomorphic perspectives on what these beings might be, and they may be absolutely nothing like that, right? So that really kind of raises questions. If they're nothing like that, then what does the market do from that standpoint? You mentioned telepathic kind of contact. I mean, what if it's a mass telepathic event? If it's something like that, well, that might change the way everything rolls out. Or if you've watched the movie Arrival, that's another good example. These giant ships just sort of hover there and they don't do anything. That's enough to arrest our behavior. Like, we don't really know what to do with them, but we can't ignore that they're there, right? So that arrested behavior kind of stalls out some of our normal routines to give us time to contemplate and think about what we might do. But in that movie, you have the situation where it's human behavior that eventually kind of escalates to this point where we might wipe each other out because we just don't know what it is. So we end up turning on each other, not knowing what that is, and that creates this moment where that it's a reflection moment for humankind to say maybe we shouldn't go down that path.
Yeah, and it's interesting hearing your reflection, because one thing that occurs to me is that many people have heard accounts of encounters with the beings, different kinds of beings. But when we reflect on what might happen from here, we kind of tell on ourselves in interesting ways in terms of the possibility space we entertain. So, in other words, people are going to have different expectations, leanings towards what's likely to happen based on their own experience. And this is true for all of us. So, for instance, for you, someone who hasn't had a personal encounter with one of these entities, it makes total sense to me that you would say they might be nothing like what we would expect them to be, because your experience is arriving from a vacuum. Someone else who's maybe had encounters with grays or reptilians are likely going to assume that it's going to follow a similar experience that they've had before, right? Really interestingly. But again, pointing to Bertie Jaworski's particular reading, she's saying this particular intelligence that's behind this is neither of those. It's something that is not human, but it's also not one of the usual NHI players that have been a major part of this phenomenon up until now. So that becomes really, really interesting in terms of where things will go. Now, let's, in the remainder of this show, dive into this delineation, this opposition between framing this as an alien or an angel or a demon. This is something that's near and dear to our hearts, the two of us, but it's also something that is kind of something that irks us because we see so often these terms being introduced by people, I would argue, sometimes who should know better, that they hand this, to use your expression, this package over to the public and say, this is going to be what it is, and then don't do any sort of work to help unpack that for people, knowing that people are going to interpret that through very standard, conventional, religious kind of ways. And that, I would argue, just creates more distortion in the field. It leads us further away from understanding what's really going on. Now, to this point recently, we both saw this documentary that was put together by Jesse Michaels that involved him, Diana Pasulka, and Carl Nell. And I think one thing I want to say right from the beginning is I think many people have been impressed by Carl Nell's breadth of understanding. And I had experience where I got to speak with Carl prior to the Seoul event, actually, in September. And I was also impressed with not just the knowledge he has with his military background and his intelligence background, but also very interested and impressed by both his astronomical understanding, but also his understanding of esoteric history and how he incorporates all of that in trying to make sense of what's going on here. And therefore, I listen closely to what he's saying because, of course, he can't reveal classified information, but what he focuses on gives you clues about what he thinks may be going on here. So it's worth paying attention in light of that. And the first thing I want to point out here is that Diana talks about this very interesting experience she had, where she had been for years a religious studies professor, and she makes the point in this documentary that her job is not to advocate for religion as a religious studies professor. She's looking at it from an academic perspective, a sociological kind of lens. And she talks about suddenly having intelligence community people from the military showing up and asking her about specific incidences from the past. Because to make those who are not aware more aware, while some people think this began around the 1940s, and certainly there was an uptick at the dawn of the atomic era, this actually goes back into history, and the argument can easily be made that we are actually experiencing some of the same entities that were experienced in traditions from long ago that were recorded in scriptures of various kind of religions. So she talks about these IC and military people contacting her and asking her for specific details like what kind of objects did they see, what kind of colors were the lights. We think about orbs and different lights. How people like Lou Elizondo have warned us that the blue orbs are dangerous, don't get too close to them. And she was able to tell them about things. And of course, it's not just lights in the sky and how they track to what these things might be, but even things like injuries that people suffered. So she raises this issue of St. Francis of Assisi being injured and experiencing stigmata, which from a modern lens might actually be electromagnetic radiation. So when you heard all that, what do you think about?
Yeah, well, I thought about the perspective that she's got the access, right? So here are individuals that may not have had the access that she had with her research in the Vatican archives and that kind of thing to these documents. And she also has that sort of pedigree to interpret some of that content or to know where to look. And so when they're asking her these types of questions, what kind of experiences are recorded in these ancient texts? They're gathering information to see if it's corroborative, right? Is anything in the ancient text of these experiences, recounted experiences, does that corroborate with what we know to be the case of more modern experiences? Chris Bledsoe, a very classic example here, and the interesting case about the thing with Chris is that his experience not only mirrors some of these more ancient experiences, St. Francis of Assisi, for example. There's a lot of corollary points here, but his interpretation of the experience is also fairly similar to some of these ancient experiences. I find that very interesting, right? So his interpretive grid is very similar to, how St. Francis would have interpreted the same kind of experience in the past. with a little bit of a spin, slightly different spin. But that's the way I look at it. That they, their information gathering to see how far back in time do these kinds of encounters go, and what are the commonalities, similarities? Because if they can get more insight into that history, that may very well impact their understanding of the present types of encounters that are taking place. But what I'm looking for really is what's their kind of larger interpretation of that. Are they looking to that and say, "Ha ha, see, here's the through line. It's been angels in the past and it's angels today." Or are they looking to say, "Aha, we have common experiences, and it's just that the way that those experiences have been interpreted has changed over human history."
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the point we really want to hit home on because many people miss this. So, for instance, I remember when I was studying this, when I was getting my biblical studies degree, we would talk about, for instance, trying to focus on people's experience and how their culture and their milieu would frame their experience. Because as we pointed out earlier in this episode, we all do it. None of us exist in a vacuum. We have to make sense of any experience in light of what we've already known to be the case and assume about reality. We do this. This is just part of the exercise here. So one thing I want to caution people here with is this is true for remote viewers. This is true for channelers. Again, some are cleaner than others. Some are doing the work to try to account for the distortions. Some people much less so. And the less likely they are to be aware of it, the much more distortions likely to come through. But importantly, while I have been a champion of experiencers and the experience that experiencers are making us aware of, experiencers are also subject to this, that we have experiences and then we make sense of them through this interpretive grid. So, like you just brought up Chris Bledsoe, for instance, not only does he interpret it in ways that are similar to some Christian history, but he, of course, is a Christian who is raised in Christian circles. Even when he's trying to account for things, that's going to play a role. And then you have to ask the question on top of that, how much do you see evidence for him or for anyone else for that matter, that they are aware of this potential bias and are trying to account for it? So this is something we really want to hit home on. Please, people, be aware of whoever you're listening to, whatever source is presenting information, including Nathan and I. Ask how much we are attempting to account for our own distortion, the way we think about these things. Now, in terms of this question of like what actually is an angel, what is an alien, we should be aware that those are labels. And what it refers to, for instance, with alien tends to be space alien, because we understand from a physicalist point of view that we live in this massive cosmos filled with trillions of stars. We assume that it makes sense that some of them would have been intelligent life by now and might be visiting us. An angel, of course, kind of speaks about different domains of existence and that they are arising from this kind of spiritual realm. But I want to bring up something that Carl Nell said here and then get your take on it, because he made a great point. And when you start thinking about the numbers and how, quote unquote, astronomical they are, pun intended, you become aware of the possibility space and how much it expands and how much our delineation between spiritual versus physical probably gets obliterated, probably collapses and ends up with a much more transcendent understanding with enough time. So, for instance, think about the fact that we now have probes that are exploring the edge of our solar system. We have rovers on Mars. And yet 100 years ago, our relatives were still in horses and buggies, basically. So think about how much has changed in the space of 100 years. And as Carl pointed out in that presentation, now imagine what 100,000 years or 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 years would make. We, of course, at that point cannot even conceive of it. Think about the quantum revolution that happened at the turn of the century. And we're still grappling with that. What would happen with 1,000,000,000 more years of understanding about the nature of reality? So he pointed out in that presentation that there are stars like our sun that are sometimes billions of years older than our sun. So if you even take a physicalist notion that evolution springs up when the right conditions are there, are present, then it makes sense that some civilizations would spring up and they would be potentially billions of years older. What would their understanding of reality be? What would the way that they could harness the power of reality show up differently? How would their understanding of consciousness perhaps being primary in the way that we are now exploring as a civilization and we've explored on this podcast, how would that change the situation? To what extent will external technology and internal consciousness work collapse into one integrated kind of framework? And what would that look like? Might that look a lot like spiritual entities to us? So let me pass it on to you for some reflections on that.
Yeah, well, 100%. And this is something that I think that we just don't spend enough time thinking about, right? I think Nell is a great communicator, and I'm so glad that he framed it in this way, because it is something that I don't think we really sit with adequately. Of course, there's the Arthur C. Clarke saying, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and I think that's, if you're into sci-fi, you've heard this before, and you maybe contemplated this before, but I think the degree to which we as a society just generally, the leaps that we're making in terms of alien technology is so proximate to where we are right now. It is like it's like a decade or 2 decades or 50 years at most from where we could be right now. And if you talk about it in terms of, eons, billions of years, it completely, any paradigm we would attempt to bring to bear on that would be inadequate. And I think this is where we need, even our imaginations are inadequate, quite frankly, to grasp it, because it's just completely confounding. And because of that true confounding quality of whatever they may be, the only category we can lump that into is spiritual. Like it transcends these, sort of normal kinds of interactions, of modalities, of technologies, of cultural paradigms. It's transcendent above all of that. It evokes within the human experience this awe and fear. Those are components that we find in the ancient texts: awe and fear and trembling, right? That's a visceral reaction to what these might be, and we then have no other category to put them into other than this highly spiritual, highly metaphysical, highly alien, to use a more modern term, category than our current experience. So the map is there, in my opinion. The mapping makes a lot of sense. I'm glad that he's talking about it. Where I get frustrated, and I know you do as well, that we just kind of stop. We don't, and most conversations in this space basically get right up to a certain point, and they just stop, and then they say, "Well, I guess they're the angels from the past." And I think that's where there's more imagination that's required to go beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. And on top of that, I was saying that Carl was making the argument just from a physicalist point of view. If you accept the modern conventions that is part of Western civilization, even then you end up with something that could look, to your point, like something spiritual to us, just because it would be so beyond, it would so transcend our understanding of what was possible that it would look like magic. Again, calling on Arthur C. Clarke there. But something else that Carl touched on, because again, I've noticed that he's done equal research into exoteric technology and esoteric technology. So he also talked about there being this overlap between different traditions, how they had different notions that actually have some degree of agreement around how you would access these deeper levels of reality. And he talked about, for instance, the Gnostic, the Sufi Muslims, Kabbalah and Judaism, and Advaita Vedanta all talk about this kind of inner initiatic experience through which you can encounter different, deeper layers of reality. I kind of want to end here because this very much comports with my experience that I had on Christmas Day, that there's no way that I could come out of that experiencing thinking that this is a physical, quote unquote, reality. This is a construct. This is a mind space. This is an idea that is being pursued by all of us, and each of us are different fragments of source consciousness. So we both follow the rules of the game that, to some degree, we have set up ourselves, although in a kind of higher fractal frame. And we also change the nature of the story based on the decisions we make. And this is part of the synchronistic overlap and echoing that happens between different fractal elements of reality. And therefore, it makes complete sense to me, I was saying this to you before we started recording, that whether we get in spaceships and pursue the edges of the cosmos, or we go into this interior work and look for deep truth there and accessing different elements of reality, that ultimately is two aspects of the same thing. So when you think about this great analogy of when there was this recognition that with quantum entanglement, what you have is not this picture where one camera is looking at the front of this aquarium and seeing one fish, and another camera is on the other side from the side view looking at a fish and seeing a different looking fish and thinking those are two different fish, ultimately the revelation was that's the same fish just seen from two different perspectives. So this esoteric and exoteric exercise ultimately arrives at the same understanding of reality, I think. And that's what we're ultimately seeing here. And so from that point of view, for me, this ultimately does collapse and it ends up arising in some sort of integrated fabric of reality of which we are the fundamental part, actually, that our consciousness is actually at the bottom of the pyramid and everything else we look at in terms of physical manifestation arises from that. And that even dovetails with Birdie's notion that these beings can basically manifest physical things from thought alone, because that is the ultimate sort of esoteric kind of teaching you find in these different traditions. So for me, this is where this is all going. This is why it's hugely fascinating. And I think in light of the precarious place we find ourselves in a civilization, it's only that kind of revolution that's ultimately going to save us from ourselves.
Yeah, so true. Um, it's a powerful moment in time. And, I feel that in many ways, it sort of depends on where you stand in receiving the blast wave that is the fragmentary explosion of source consciousness. It's one explosion that occurs from that source consciousness differentiating out into the world that is all of conscious experience. You know, and where do you stand as that shock wave kind of blasts out from that moment? And I know this is a very kind of temporal way of looking at it, and we talked about how temporality is not an adequate framework either. But where do we stand, and how do we interpret that felt experience of the same event? If we're close to that event, we maybe feel it in its more raw power. If we're further from the event, we feel it maybe like a subtle breeze, and it just feels like a breeze on the wind. But it's a reflection. It's the same thing, just kind of hitting us at different times and different experiences, different places in our lives. And so, this is it's a combination, as you say, of outer work and inner work, and ultimately those things kind of conflate into one another. But it is work nonetheless, right? It's not something that we can, I think, necessarily arrive at, and we've talked about that a lot as well. And I hope that that's. I mean, I'm saying this for myself, and I hope that that's something that our listeners take too. That this is not a place that you just arrive at and you're done. This is not the kind of disclosure where it's the last sentence in the last chapter. This is a story that is constantly unfolding, and will do so infinitely from my perspective. And so from that vantage, it's very exciting. This is a truly exciting time to see and to experience where we are right now. To have this front row seat, as you and I often talk about, this front row seat to this really felt sense of change and transformation. It's truly remarkable. And, I, for one, am excited to be part of that conversation. I'm sad, honestly, when I see folks that kind of just want to poo-poo this entire thing and they want to go out of their way to just say there's nothing to this. I find that to be just unfortunate. It's an energy that I do not identify with in any way, shape, or form. But nevertheless, they're part of the story too, and I'm grateful for them. Especially grateful for all of you listeners. It's been a really nice year, 2024, as we close our last Liminal Phrames of the year. And as we turn the chapter to 2025, we certainly are looking ahead and are looking to see new experiences, but also to experience those things alongside you and with you, the community. And so we're grateful for all of you and for what you share with us. And you're very much a part of this conversation. It's certainly something that this is not a two-person show. It's really a host. There's a host of folks that are, putting energy and intention into this experience. And we feel that. So thank you for that. On that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits, and a Happy New Year. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.